Hey, good morning, everybody. This video is going to be for anybody who wants to um, avoid doing a live lecture. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to run through the first little bit about international trade before you move on to the World Trade Organization article that I'm going to have you read. So I'm going to share the screen. Let's do this. So I'm actually going to bounce back and forth between two different sets. Okay, so first, look at this one. We're going to start with 3.1. International trade. Hopefully you read the sections in Cognitive. The goal here is to describe and evaluate the purpose of international trade. Think for a moment, please. Where do the goods in our country come from? And this is the United States, okay? So where does it come from? What's your guess? All right. Take a look. I would go ahead and collect some data. Check out some of the stuff that you own and check out where those things are made. More often than not, it's not going to be in the United States. That's not to say we don't make anything, but we import a lot. We have a massive trade deficit. That being said, number one provider is China. You probably were of the school of thought that China massively outnumbered every other place we trade with. But, they are in first, but we also export the most to them. So we export 19%, we import 19.8, and that 0.8% amounts to a lot of money. But that being said, I should also say these aren't equal numbers. This is just the amount that we receive from them, and then 19% of our total traded goods go to China. But you have to understand this is a much larger number coming from China because we import way more than they do. So that 19% that they import from us is not the same. So a couple of things that you need to know about with a little background vocabulary. Free trade, all right? So that's open trade between two or more countries with no barriers in place from the government. So in other words, there's no regulations. You just trade for free. Protectionism is government intervention in international trade through barriers of entry. So some of those barriers of entry could be tariffs, subsidies, and quotas. Tariffs are taxes imposed on imports from another country, and usually they're targeted on specific things. You probably heard a lot about Donald Trump's use of tariffs against China to try to get better trade agreements with them. Haven't heard much about that lately, mainly because everything else going on, but that is a tool. People don't like it because as far as your international relations are concerned, like how well you get along, it usually doesn't go very well because you're basically saying like, hey, you're taxed. I'm taxing this. And then you get into a back and forth, and it can really hurt industries. For example, we know that China is the number one pork consumer in the world. And when Donald Trump's tariffs were put in place, the Chinese responded by, initially anyway, by trying to hit the pork industry in the United States. I think they've loosened that quite a bit, but it's still a thing. Quotas is a specific amount or a limit on specific goods for total goods imported. You can't have more than X amount. And then subsidies are payments. We already know about those, but payments by domestic countries to increase the production of a domestic good, unfairly boosting competition. Remember, when we give subsidies to farmers, for example, it makes their goods cheaper, depending on what it is. So there's been a lot of flack for the United States. They're in an agreement called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and we give subsidies to our farmers, and that gives our farmers a competitive edge on Canada and Mexico, despite the fact that we said that they have equal access to the market. Well, then but then the American government says, okay, well, we're going to still give our farmers an advantage, and that doesn't seem fair to them, at least as far as a free trade agreement is concerned. So we got to talk about a little bit of background, a little bit more background. This is going to be a topic for tomorrow. So I'm just going to give you the vocabulary, and then I'm going to switch to the other slideshow. So comparative advantage occurs when a country has lower relative costs or opportunity costs in the production of one good compared to another country. So that you can tell that we're going to get back into the PPF diagram with this, right? Because you're going to be comparing the possibility production frontier or production possibility frontier, because you're going to be comparing and contrasting against other countries, though. So this is coming full circle, coming back to the very first diagram that we did. Absolute advantage is the other one, which occurs when a country can produce more of a given product with the same or less resources. And that's where trade comes in. And so I'm going to give you a breakdown of that, like I said, on Friday with a little bit of math, okay? So let's switch over here real quick. I just want to run through a couple of things. So, percent. Once again, make sure that you know that when we engage in free trade, governments do not implement barriers. So, like I said, if you have a subsidy, that's technically a barrier because you're giving your own people an advantage over those. So it's not truly free trade. Remember, all of these things are possible. Ban, limit, or tax imports, regulatory administration requirements. All right, so the breakdown of those three terms that we just talked about a second ago. But we refer to those as government intervention. Right? Please be aware of a couple of other things. Domestic producers cannot always produce enough for our population. This is why we have international trade. We open up new markets for all producers willing to exploit new opportunities. By expanding, producers will be able to lower their average total cost of production in the long run and benefit from economies of scale. So remember, theory of the firm ties into that a little bit. So we're building off of a lot of the conversations that we've had over the last year and a half. I guess it's less than a year and a half, a year. With that said, okay, understand that economies of scale in the long run, it might be better. Like, so you could have firms from the United States open factories in different places, and that might lower their overall total costs, benefiting them in the long run. And then you start to get into that world of multinational corporations. Oops. Just remember, with producers will be able to acquire a wider variety of resources, LDCs, with increased competition, improvement in efficiency of firms, and improve the global allocation of resources. Remember, it's basically all that I just said wrapped up. All right, a couple more things. I'm going to show you diagram number 40. This is Spain's cheese market. You got the price of cheese versus the quantity of cheese. You got supply and demand, and then you've got the supply world. Doesn't influence world price, P1, right? Lower than Spain would produce on its own. Okay, so the supply is here. The world supply is here, right? Low price, right? Consumers demand more. So at the world traded price, you have higher demand because it's cheaper. Spain supplies less of the quantity on its own, and it's more expensive. So importing cheese is a good idea, right? Typically, this is what you see. If you have the world price for something is over the top here, over the Spain's equilibrium for cheese, if you will, then it's more expensive to import. You'll probably see most people in Spain not importing a lot of cheese or not buying imported cheese that much because it's more expensive. Just be aware, right? It doesn't always work like this, but you're going to have the world. Basically, you'll have a horizontal line for whatever the world standard price is. Or if you even want to like say, let's say this is France instead, you could say imported cheese from France or the United States or whatever. It all depends on what that price is and what that supply is. The supply seems to always be the same, right? Because it's coming from wherever, an unlimited amount of cheese, I suppose. But the price is always going to remain the same, and it's cheaper. All right, so just keep that in mind. Hold on, I gotta see what's next. Okay, so two more. First, other aspects of free trade worth noting are that voluntary trade is mutually beneficial to both countries. Like typically people engage in trade because they need to or they want to because it's in some way, shape, or form good. Lower prices happen because of specialization in markets. Like there are other places in the world that can produce certain things way better than the United States. And there are things in the United States that we can do that we are way more efficient at and better at. For example, up until fairly recently with the updates in their software, Boeing was our number one export. They had a huge list. Countries around the world wanted to buy from Boeing. They still do, but you can probably guess because of their recent issues that they had a few cancellations. Like I said, there are political benefits as well. It's hard to avoid that. Trading your trade partners. I mean, you have to think about the relationships. Think about your own personal relationships. Typically, you're friends with people, and that friendship might go beyond just liking each other's personalities. Like you might be able to maybe somebody's really good at math and you're really good at social studies and remembering things, and you like trade ideas and study together, and there's a benefit there to the relationship. It's the same thing with countries. There are certain resources, there are certain technologies, and then your politics tend to align. You come together and make decisions on a worldwide scale. It makes things easier. So finally, I just want to introduce the World Trade Organization. It's out of Geneva, Switzerland. You're going to do a little bit of reading about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically administering the WTO trade agreements. So World Trade Organization creates agreements between countries on a worldwide scale. They are also arbiters, so they will act as kind of like the negotiator for trade deals. They handle disputes for its members. They monitor individual national trade policies. And ultimately, they basically just try to develop the rest of the world's economies. They try to, especially the developing world, where they get them to maximize and grow in the most sustainable way possible. And I don't mean sustainable in an environmental sense. Like I mean like continued growth. All right. So that's the World Trade Organization. Like I said, I'm going to have you read something now. So this is about it on the information that you need. The negatives I don't want to get into until tomorrow or Friday, just because we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what the WTO is and kind of its pros and cons, what it can do and what it's unable to do. All right. So anyway, that's it. I'll talk to you guys later.